This sampling of research is of writing and art that's produced through the influence of unseen entities. The research has been largely done to determine whether the entities rather than the medium were responsible for the writing and the art, whether the resulting information is accurate. There's a large body of literature with recorded observations. This presentation presents examples from each of the following areas of research: automatic writing, direct writing, precipitated writing, slate writing, independent typewriter writing, precipitated arts, and spirit portrait drawings. So as you see, it is much broader than simply automatic writing. So let's start with automatic writing. The first area is automatic writing. In automatic writing, the writer is entirely unaware of what the hand is writing and has no control over the hand's movements. The writing and signature most often match samples of the person's writing from their time on Earth, on this side of life. It differs from inspired writing, that is often called automatic writing. In inspired writing, the writer is in control of the process and writes what the person in spirit inspires. A prominent example is Chico Xavier. There are two varieties of automatic writing. In the first, the medium enters a mild trance state, steps aside mentally, and allows the messages to flow freely onto paper, not knowing what is being written and being more or less alert. The second is with a trance in which the entities take over the medium's nervous system and do the writing. The feeling of having the hand moved by those in spirit is described as the feeling of holding in the hand a handkerchief over a fluttering bird. The most studied automatic writing medium was Leonora Piper, who lived in New England until her transition in 1950. While in trance, her control Finuit spoke using her vocal mechanism. Piper would rest her head on a pillow on a table with her face toward the left. Writing material was arranged on the right side, usually 100 blank sheets of paper and 4 or 5 soft lead pencils. After she went into trance, someone would place a sheet of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand. Piper's hand would write pages after page while she was in trance, with someone removing each sheet after it was filled and replacing it with a fresh one. Two personalities were able to control Piper and conduct conversations with individual sitters or groups of sitters while she was in trance. Her control personality in spirit, Finuit, used Piper's voice in a normal way, holding conversations with the sitters. At the same time, other individuals in spirit were using Piper's writing hand to write continuously about unrelated subjects, oblivious to the conversations Finuit was having through Piper. Members of the British Society for Psychical Research invited Piper to stay with them in England so they could observe her mediumistic performance. She was studied by Dr. William James, the father of American psychology, Dr. Richard Hodgson, an English investigator of psychic phenomena, Dr. Oliver Lodge, professor of physics at University College in Liverpool, Dr. James Hislop, professor of ethics and logic at Columbia University, and Frederick W.H. Myers, a British classicist. Piper held regular sittings in England with the 5 researchers for the next 3 months, with Oliver Lodge alone attending 83 sittings. As a result of their experiences, Frederick Myers, Richard Hodgson, and James Hislop each wrote extensive reports, concluding that based on their observations, Piper's talents were legitimate. In the United States, William James sat with Piper for 18 months, carefully monitoring her and controlling the seance arrangements. James wrote in the 1890 Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, and I repeat again what I said before, that taking everything that I know of Mrs. Piper into account, the result is to make me feel as absolutely certain as I am of any personal fact in the world, that she knows things in her trances which she cannot possibly have heard in her waking state, and that the definite philosophy of her trances is yet to be found. The next area of research is direct writing. In direct writing, the writing results from some instrument or action, but without the medium's control. Sir William Crookes, an English chemist and physicist who discovered thallium and invented the radiometer and other devices, recorded his first experience in direct writing with physical medium Kate Fox Jenkins. This is his description of the experience. A luminous hand came down from the upper part of the room, and after hovering near me for a few seconds, took the pencil from my hand, rapidly wrote on a sheet of paper, threw the pencil down, and then rose up over our heads, gradually fading into darkness. Robert Dale Owen, a member of the United States Congress, sat with medium Henry Slade on February 9th, 1874. During the sitting, Owen observed a white, feminine, marble-like hand, detached and shaded off at the wrist, creep up Slade's knees onto the table. The hand grasped a pencil, wrote on the notepaper that had been placed on the table, and slipped back with the pencil underneath the table. 5 minutes later, the performance was repeated by a smaller hand that resembled the first. In seances with another medium, Mrs. Thomas Everett, Sir William Crookes tested the medium's direct writing. Folded sheets in a sealed envelope were marked and inserted into a closed book. The book was placed in a locked box with a pencil in it. When the box was opened and the envelope unsealed, the paper was found to have writing on both sides. No matter how thin the paper was, the pencil produced no indentation. Nevertheless, it was clear that the pencil had been used, since once the words appeared double because the lead had a double edge on it. Another supernormal phenomenon was the speed with which the scripts were delivered. The next area of research is precipitated writing. Precipitated writing appears on a surface with no human hand or writing instrument involved. Some precipitated writing has occurred using slates that I explain later in this presentation. In 1889, Dr. Paul Gibier, founder of the Pasteur Institute in New York, set out to study reports that hypnotized subjects were able to project characters and lines of writing on blank sheets of paper. He and 20 witnesses observed a seance in which he witnessed two hypnotized subjects sitting apart from carefully observed blank sheets of paper when writing precipitated in full light. The observation was signed by all 20 witnesses. The precipitated writing was a full page of written verses, signed Corneille. The Skull Experimental Group was a group of sitters in Skull, Norfolk, England, who engaged in physical mediumship from 1994 to 1998. The group produced a wide range of phenomena and was investigated for 2 years by 3 senior members of the Society for Psychical Research. Dr. Walter Schnitger, a consultant engineer, and his wife Karen had heard that undeveloped film would have words and images precipitated on it during the school group seances. Dr. Schnitger arranged to test whether such a phenomenon was possible. The Schnitgers brought their own Polaroid 35 millimeter film in a box. Both the Schnitgers checked the room before the rest of the group entered the room. Dr. Schnitger marked the film and placed the unexposed film in a box in the center of a table on a sheet of plain white paper and padlocked the box. Dr. Schnitger drew a line around the perimeter of the box on the underlying paper, showing the exact position of the box and the location of the padlock, which hung down onto the paper. Each group member wore a luminous wristband to ensure that all knew the positions of other group members. No one left their seat. Dr. Schnitger held the box in his hands throughout the entire session. When the session was finished, Dr. Schnitger confirmed that the box was in precisely the original position. The unexposed film was retrieved from the box and touched only by the 2 Schnitgers. Dr. Schnitger checked the marks on the film to ensure there was no substitution. The 2 Schnitgers supervised the developing. What emerged on the film was a dragon image. In the right area of the film was a cross with something entwining the cross, possibly a serpent, and a landscape with mountains or trees and clouds. In another area of the film, on the left were letters the skull group interpreted as standing for the initial letters of the Hebrew names for God. The words in the middle of the strip of film, Quadrans Muralis, refer to a star constellation originated by an astronomer in 1795, who named it for the wall-mounted quadrant he used to plot and observe stars. A triangle, an unknown symbol, appeared on the right extreme of the strip of film. In another image on the same film, the word or name Cassil appeared and an unknown symbol. The reason for its position on the film is not known. The next area of research is slate writing. In slate writing, those in spirit write on slates without the medium's physical involvement in the writing. The slates were of the kind used by school children in the 19th century when paper was in short supply. The slates could be written upon and erased for new usage. The chalk most often wasn't like the school chalk used today. It was soapstone or softer pieces of slate cut into strips to form the familiar shape of a writing instrument. A piece of cloth or sponge was used to clean the slate. The cloth was often attached with a string to the bottom of the writing slate. At times, slate writing was done by having two of these slates bound together with a string or other binding. There was sufficient space between the slates because they had wood frames, so that a small crumb of chalk could be inserted. At other times, the slate was placed flat on a table with the crumb of chalk under it, or held against the underside of the table with a piece of chalk against the table. Guests observing would often bring their own slates and observe closely as the slates were bound together with no writing on them. The activity could occur in light or darkness. Often scratching could be heard coming from the slates. When opened, there were messages to the sitters. The first example of research and observation of slate writing, Fred Evans from San Francisco. The editor of the Golden Gate newspaper, David L. Holub, and his wife had a session with Evans on May 18, 1887. Evans' psychographic guide was a man in spirit named John Gray. The three sat at a table in full daylight. John Gray signaled his presence by raps on the table. Holub asked Gray whether he could bring together a number of spirits of different earthly nationalities who would write short messages on the slate. Gray communicated that he agreed. Holub inspected the slate and was satisfied that there was no writing or other marking on it. From that moment, the slate never left Holub's hands. A small crumb of slate pencil was placed on the table. The two sitters placed the slate over it and rested their hands on it. The medium, sitting on the opposite side of the table, touched the outer edge of the slate frame for a few minutes and then removed his hands entirely. In about 5 minutes, a loud rap signaled the writing was finished. This is the slate that resulted. The languages on the slate were German, Italian, French, Greek, Spanish, Norwegian, Chinese, Japanese, Hebrew, Egyptian, and Old Asiatic. John Gray had given Holub what he asked for. Another slate medium was P.L.O.A. Keeler at Lilydale, New York, a hamlet whose residents are largely connected to spiritualism. 3 officers of the Lilydale Assembly, the oversight body for medium activities at Lilydale, conducted an investigation of Keeler's mediumship. During the afternoon of Thursday, July 23, 1908, Mrs. Humphrey, President, H.W. Richardson, Vice President, and George Warnay, Treasurer, selected 2 slates from the center of a newly opened bundle of slates bought at the general store and placed a special stamp that could not be duplicated on the frames and writing surfaces of the inner side of the slates. The 2 slates were placed on the table with a small crumb of slate chalk beneath each. Each sitter wrote their name on a separate slip of paper, folded it tightly, and placed it on the table beside the slates. No names of friends in spirit were at any time written by the sitters. The slips, slates, and Mr. Keeler's hands were never out of sight of the 3 officers' eyes. At the close of the 1¼ hours sitting, the slates were turned over. On the 2 slates were 1 message from a brother of Mr. Richardson, 4 messages for Mrs. Humphrey and her immediate family, 2 messages for Dr. Warnay, and 1 for an unidentified personality. 1 was written in yellow, but the others were from the common slate pencil crumb that was placed between the slates at the beginning of the seance. When the folded papers with participants' names on them were opened, words written in green appeared on the paper bearing Dr. Warren's signature. The message read, "It is difficult to get anything on slates not magnetized." We don't know what that means, and it would be worth the research to find out why that was true. The investigators concluded the messages were not written in advance. A substitution of slates was impossible. Mr. Keeler could not have written them during the sitting, for he could not have gained access to the inside surfaces where they were found without immediate detection. Another group of 6 board members conducted an investigation the following day, taking similar precautions, and received 11 messages in Greek, German, French, Swedish, and Japanese or Chinese. Linguists consulted afterwards said the Greek, French, and Swedish messages were all grammatically correct. The report was signed by all 6 members of the board who took part in the investigation. In another study, Dr. William Barrett, a physicist and co-founder of the Society for Psychical Research, tested the direct writing done by medium Henry Slade. Dr. Barrett provided a clean slate. He put a crumb of slate pencil on the table, placed the slate over the crumb of pencil, held it firmly down with his elbow, and allowed only the tips of Slade's fingers to touch the slates. He observed the following. While closely watching both of Slade's hands, which did not move perceptibly, I was much astonished to hear scratching going on apparently on the underside of the table. And when the slate was lifted up, I found the side facing the table covered with writing. A similar result was obtained on other days. The next area of research is independent typewriter typing. In independent typewriter typing, the medium sits with a group of sitters around a typewriter. The entities in spirit manipulating the typewriter cause the keys to strike, typing out messages. A group of researchers, including a Professor Ames, asked medium Lizzie Bangs, one of the famous Bangs sisters, to demonstrate her automatic keyboard actions during the Chicago World's Fair in 1895 for them to observe the phenomenon. 4 sitters and Lizzie Bangs sat in the dark around a table with a typewriter on it. The early typewriters required considerable effort to type, so unseen hands typing on them would have been quite a feat. All joined hands, including Lizzie Bangs, who was behind the typewriter. As the machine began typing on its own, Professor Ames, who was facing the typewriter keys, bent his head down over the machine till his face almost touched the keys, and the keys continued to type. Ames reported that there was no room for a hand, spirit, or human to intervene between his face and the keys. When the first message was finished, the sheet was taken out by those in spirit, put into a box beneath the machine, and a fresh sheet of paper was adjusted into the machine. 5 messages were thus written and put into the box. When the seance was finished, the sitters found in the box a message addressed to each sitter. Professor Ames stated that the typing was more rapid than could be done by any of his secretaries. Another report of Lizzie Bangs' independent typewriting was published in the June 1893 edition of Light of Truth by journalist George Lieberknecht. This is Lieberknecht's account. The circle consisted of 6 men and 1 lady besides the medium. We were seated closely around the small table with hands joined. A typewriter was placed on the small table in the center. Before the lights were put out, the door was locked. The medium sat in the circle just like the rest of us, but facing the back, not the front of the typewriter. I feel confident in saying the medium does not touch the typewriter at all. It is used independent of without contact from the medium's hands or fingers. There is no holding or hesitating in the action of the machine. On the contrary, You hear that it is operated with an astonishing degree of swiftness and dexterity. When one letter or message is finished, the sheet is removed, folded up, addressed on the machine, and the next one is printed until each one of the sitters has one. The one addressed to the writer of this article from his son contains 186 words. In mechanical execution, this independent typewriter, of which I examined several specimens at the close of the seance, is done in a neat, clear, businesslike manner. And although punctilious critics could point out some errors in punctuation, the performance is as good as the letters one receives from first-class business houses. The next area of research investigates the phenomenon called precipitated art. Precipitated art is a work of art, usually a portrait, that appears on canvas without the use of human hands or brushes. It also includes images that appear on cards. For most spirit paintings, a new clean canvas or paper is stretched over a 24-inch by 36-inch or a 24-inch by 30-inch wood frame. Pots of paint with all the colors of the spectrum are placed nearby. No brushes are used, and none are in the room or area where the seance is taking place. Often the person coming to receive a portrait of their loved one brings their own canvas. The mediums may hold the canvas on either side of it, but have no control over what happens. The images of the person in spirit appear on the canvas over a period of 15 or 20 minutes. In most instances, no similar photo likeness was ever taken of the person in spirit, precluding the possibility of pre-painting and switching the canvas. Also, color photography had not then been invented, and in the examples I will show, you will see color. Art experts have examined the portraits and cannot explain the medium used. It is not paint, ink, pastel, or any known substance. It looks as though it had been applied with a modern airbrush and has the consistency of the powder of a butterfly's wings. The most prominent artists were the Bang sisters and the Campbell brothers. Following is an example of the Bang sisters' precipitated art. In August 1911, a large audience filled to capacity the auditorium at Chesterfield Spiritualist Camp in Indiana. A large plain canvas was placed on an easel in the center of the stage. A committee set up to oversee the event examined the canvas to be sure there were no markings, paint, or chemical treatments. The Bang sisters sat on either side of the easel, 4 to 5 feet from it. They never touched the canvas throughout the entire demonstration. Tickets had been given out to the audience before the event so that someone could be selected at random to have a precipitated portrait of a loved one in spirit. And a ticket was drawn for Mrs. Alice Alford. Mrs. Alford and her husband took seats on the stage. The Bangs sisters slowly bowed their heads and closed their eyes as if in prayer and deep concentration for 5 minutes. Then a thin vapor-like cloud or shadow swept over the canvas, pulsating and then flickering out. After a few more minutes, shades of gray, shades of color began to appear in successive layers of fine dust to form a cloudy background that seems to pulsate and flicker and then quickly disappear. The background slowly and steadily precipitated into view. 3 pairs of eyes appeared on different parts of the canvas, 2 of which were open and 1 pair in the center of the canvas was closed. The 2 open pairs disappeared and the closed eyes remained, then disappeared. With each successive phase of the unfolding phenomena, the background became clearer and clearer. Then a faint outline of a face and bust slowly precipitated into view, disappearing and reappearing several times before remaining in focus on the canvas. It was the likeness of a girl, 14 to 15 years old. Her eyes were closed. When the portrait was completely precipitated onto the canvas, the eyes suddenly opened and the audience applauded. Mr. Alfred said the portrait was an exact likeness of their deceased daughter. Mrs. Alfred wore around her neck, hidden from sight, a locket containing a photograph of her daughter. The portrait was a duplicate in likeness of their daughter, but different in poise and position. The mediums had not seen the locket picture or any photo of the child and had never met the Alfords before the session. The finished spirit portrait was precipitated onto the canvas in 22 minutes. In another example, Dr. Doherty, a physician in Richmond, Indiana, in the early 1920s, sat with Lizzie Bangs for a portrait of his deceased wife. His wife precipitated onto the canvas. He then asked the spirit operators why his twin children, Mary and Christina, who were also deceased, were not in the picture. The twins appeared on the canvas in front of their mother. Dr. Doherty himself then appeared on the canvas, standing behind them, all making a family portrait. There are also many precipitated paintings from the Campbell brothers' medium activity, such as those of Napoleon Bonaparte and Abraham Lincoln. There are now 22 such portraits in the Chesterfield camp, and a great number are still in the hands of the families who received them. The final area of research is spirit portrait painting. Spirit or portrait artists draw likenesses of people in spirit when contacted by family members for a reading. Coral Polge, a very talented spirit portrait artist, explained the process she goes through when drawing the portrait of a person in spirit. I literally feel as though I am the person I'm drawing. Size, temperament, all of it becomes me. And I try to put down what I feel rather than anything I actually see. Sometimes I don't even know if I'm drawing a lady or a gentleman until I've got it on paper. Maurice Barbanel, editor of the Psychic News, helped her by advising that she demand a higher percentage of relatives come forward, and she had never thought about demanding from the spirit people, but it worked. Examples of such portrait artists are these by Coral Polge, these by Coral Ryder, these by Rita Berkowitz, and these by Joseph Scheel. And that is the end. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Helané, for inviting me to participate in this and to share my more than 30 years of study of the Hamilton research in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So I've changed the presentation a little bit today, in part aware that there's several individuals participating who've seen this before. So I've changed the focus to be the physical medium Mary Ann Marshall, who was studied over a period of 22 years by Dr. T. Glenn Hamilton, whose work was continued by his widow Lillian between 1935 and 1944. And then the research with Mary Ann Marshall was picked up again by an Icelandic woman who was a medium herself, Sylvia Barber, from 1947 to 1958. So here's the photograph. We're going to come back to this, but this is the photograph that convinced me of the authenticity of some ectoplasm. And you'll see this is Mary Ann Marshall. There's obviously what the typical ectoplasmic mass that looks like cotton batting or cheesecloth, which is why the critics dismiss it so readily. But you'll see inside of that is the miniature face of a man by the name of Charles Haddon Spurgeon in that. So we'll come back to that. Thomas Glendinning Hamilton conducted careful psychical research experiments in Winnipeg between 1918 and 1935 when he passed rather prematurely. His research attracted international attention, and one of the unique aspects of the Hamilton research was the group mediumship that developed among many of the participants over a period of years. There was a wide array of phenomena studied by the Hamiltons, starting with mental telepathy experiments. Very briefly, they did some experimentation with wax molds of fingertips, as was studied in Europe and elsewhere. The next major phase was telekinetic table movements and non-contact table levitations, and that topic has already been covered by Everton yesterday. So I'm only going to show one photograph of the Hamilton table levitations. I'm not going to touch at all on the deep trance writing, drawing, or speech automatisms, but I am going to focus on the small, unorganized teleplasmic manifestations, which very quickly moved to what the Hamiltons described as more intentional teleplasms, and sometimes larger, that bore miniature faces. Dr. Hamilton was born in 1873 near Scarborough, Ontario, lived on the Canadian prairies, moving to Winnipeg in 1891. He graduated with his Doctor of Medicine from the Manitoba Medical College in 1903, and 3 years later married his wife, Lillian May Forrester. He came to be known by his family and colleagues as TGH for short. Here's a portrait photograph from the early 1930s of Dr. Hamilton. And here is his wife, who herself was a graduate in nursing and TG's closest colleague throughout the experiments. And as I mentioned, she continued the research from 1935. Within weeks of TG's passing, the group was meeting again, and she finally wrapped up her experiments in 1944. Here's a photograph of the Hamilton home, into which they moved in 1910. So it wasn't their first home, but a much larger new home. And I just want to mention, I can't cover the biography of the Hamiltons today, but they were intensely involved in political, social, and church affairs in the community of Elmwood, where they lived. Dr. Hamilton had a large medical practice. He was a medical lecturer at the university. He was also involved politically as a member of the Winnipeg School Board, and then elected to the provincial legislature in Manitoba for the community of Elmwood. And he was an elder in his church, at first Presbyterian, which in Canada united with the Methodist and Congregational congregations in 1925 to form the United Church of Canada. During TGH's lifetime, there were three main phases to the research: thought transference, followed by table tilting and levitation, and then with the introduction of the medium Marianne Marshall, the group studied teleplasm, more commonly known today as ectoplasm, between 1928 and 1934. I'm just going to show this one photograph of the table levitations because I really like the table levitations. They are much less complicated than dealing with ectoplasm. On the left, you'll see the photograph of a table completely levitated. In the corner, he was supposed to have pulled the string to enclose the table within the wooden cabinet. That's James Malcolm Bird, who was the research officer for the American Society for Psychical Research. You'll see beside him Elizabeth Poole, whom Everton mentioned yesterday. Elizabeth Poole, and I'm very fortunate to have met descendants of most of these mediums, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So that's Mrs. Poole, the medium who had the ability to produce this amazing telekinetic effect. And beside her is Dr. Hamilton, who's got one hand, his right hand raised to protect them from the table because they knew this table was going to go flying. And in his left hand, he's got, you can see only a cable there, but he's got a remote control apparatus in his left hand that was used to ignite the flashes. And on the right-hand side of this screen, you'll see a table, and these are the most impressive ones, are the tables that where there's no contact. It's a non-contact table levitation. The medium is turned toward the corner of the room, and but there's no physical contact between humans and the levitated table. And that's what we need scientifically if we're going to prove anything. And that's why I'm most passionate about the macro PK and the table levitations. As mentioned, the ectoplasm is much more challenging and problematic, as we saw from discussions yesterday already. So Marianne Marshall becomes a regular member of the Hamilton group in 1928. She had attended a few times previously. And at that point, or soon after, the focus shifted to the study of teleplasm that manifested. I'm just going to use the definition of teleplasm that the Hamiltons used, that being a subtle living matter present in the body of a medium and which is capable of assuming various semi-solid or solid states for a brief time, which can be and have been felt and photographed. Now, ectoplasm generally refers to an exteriorized substance. The term was first used, as best as we've been able to determine, in 1881 by William Benjamin Carpenter, a scientist in the field of cell biology, in a revised edition of a textbook he published. However, it was Charles Richet who claimed to have invented the term to describe exteriorized substance observed in the study of Eusapia palladino during the 1890s. And there's some controversy because Frederick William and Henry Myers, who dies in 1903, there's reference to, I believe it's ectoplasy, and I haven't had time, no one else has either, had time to try to reconcile the competing claims between Myers and Richet as to whom used the term first. It's also the substance is also being referred to as psychoplasm, idioplasm, and teleplasm, the term preferred by the Hamiltons. And yesterday, Wendy Zamet referred to it as photoplasm. And there's no clear distinction between these different terms. I'm just acknowledging that they've all been used to describe this mysterious substance. The Hamilton photographic record of these teleplasms, and I'm going to show you lots of photographs momentarily, provide the best photographic record worldwide of teleplasm, followed possibly by the Schrank-Nutzing photographs that Peter Mulasch mentioned, or the research that he mentioned a few minutes ago. The Hamilton research and Hamilton archive, in my opinion, is stronger because the correspondence, the seance notes, the minutes, the attendance registers, all of that material has survived. And what we know, based on calculations done by, I believe it was by Margaret Hamilton Bach, the Hamilton's daughter, later, she calculated that between 1928 and 1934, there were 72 separate teleplasms, but those were photographed on only 50 evenings, 50 different photographic experiments that involved 60 flashlight exposures, because in some instances, there was more than one piece of teleplasm evident in a single photograph. And in a number of occasions, there was a second flash exposure. So there were two flash exposures on a given evening. And that's how we come up with 72 teleplasms. But because of the large number of cameras that Dr. Hamilton used, there are over 30 photographic images existing in the archives at the University of Manitoba, taken from different angles. So here, to begin, you can see Mary Ann Marshall seated in a wooden cabinet. The windows behind the cabinet on the wall have been permanently darkened. There's a bell box up in the right top hand corner of the cabinet. With the way that we're looking at it, there's a bell box that's been mounted there. And this is one of the very earliest photographs of ectoplasm, teleplasm, and it's a mass protruding from Mary Ann Marshall's nose and or mouth. And we can't see it in this photograph, but there were actually bell cords extending up to the bell box that were used to cause the box to ring, that were able to exert the pressure on the top of the box and cause the bell to ring. Now, a bit of information about Mary Ann Marshall. She was born in 1880 in Glasgow, Scotland. Or near Glasgow, Scotland, had a traumatic childhood and very limited education. With her husband, William Marshall, and their three children, at least two of whom were adopted. They came to Winnipeg, Manitoba, about 1920. And before she began the physical mediumship that developed in the Hamilton group, she had been a teacup reader in a local in a local shop in Winnipeg, and possibly also in Scotland. Here's a larger photograph of Mary Marshall so that we can see what she looks like. She's in a deep trance here. Her eyes are rolled upwards and back. This is an example of a photograph that has at least 3 or 4 separate pieces of teleplasm. The one which was described as a tie in some instances, I believe, below her chin, has a miniature face, which was identified as that of the deceased Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, the British Prime Minister. And interestingly, this is the only example within the Hamilton research of this brooch, this necklace with a brooch attached to it, which was claimed to have been materialized. That wasn't on her body when she was searched before the seance. And all precautions, all usual precautions were taken. There were no, to my knowledge, there were no searches of bodily orifices, but they did replace all of her clothing, and her body would be bathed by one of the inspected and bathed by one of the women sitters. Here we're moving to larger pieces of ectoplasm. These were described as imitatively manipulated, and this is obviously in the shape of a hand. This is what causes disbelievers to reject ectoplasm entirely out of hand, so to speak, because it's just so hard to believe. I'm going to be focusing on the examples that are more developed and more harder to explain, I guess. So here's the name of Flammarion. The 2 mediums are leaning forward within the cabinet. Those are the sisters-in-law. Mary Ann Marshall has got the darker hair and the dark dress. Her sister-in-law, Susan Marshall, is beside her. Their hands are loosely controlled, but it's not clear that the 2 mediums' hands are controlled. The skeptic would say that one or both of them could have reached around and pasted the name of Flammarion to the cabinet wall. There's no absolute proof in these matters, obviously. Here we have the Katie King face miniature, and that is Susan Marshall, sister-in-law, who's lying down, and William Cooper has his hand on Susan Marshall's forehead. It becomes a bit more complicated to explain how this ectoplasm, this very intricate ectoplasm, came to be attached to the back wall of the cabinet, because at this point it would involve presumably the assistance of or the collusion with Mr. Cooper, because otherwise, if Susan Marshall was up and about tacking the ectoplasm to the back wall of the seance room as to the cabinet, then Cooper would have been aware of her movements. Here's an enlargement of Katie King. You can see the miniature face. You can see the very natural looking hair. And of course, the challenge is all of that, the background, the material on which Katie King has been constructed looks like the crinoline or netting from a woman's hat, something that would have been readily accessible in the 1930s, with a little bit of tissue added for good measure. I'm being cynical, but added for good measure, which doesn't help in believing that these phenomena could be genuine. Again, a couple of years later, here's another hand in April of 1932. That's after an elapsed time of 9 minutes. The hand is obviously, the ectoplasm is coming from Mary Marshall's mouth. Again, Susan Marshall is seated beside her, and Mary Marshall has her left hand on the head of another medium in the group who's leaning over the table that's in the center of the group. And so that hand is being supported on Mary Ann Marshall's hand. Here is a side view. So if this is, as is often argued, regurgitated material, it's got quite a bit of structure there. That's why I'm showing this extra photograph. It's got quite a bit of structure to stay rigid between Mary Ann Marshall's mouth and where it's touching her hand. And in the Hamilton record, they discuss the interwoven fibers and how the material from which the hand is constructed is tightly compacted. Here's another one of the later teleplasms from the end of December 1933, coming from somewhere behind Marianne Marshall, so it's not coming from her mouth. There is a story around the indistinct face in the ectoplasm, that it was someone's guide, a guide of one of the circle members, I believe. I don't know how it was recognized through the trance speech, through the discussion. There was recognition of who the guide was. And yeah, so this one, how is that being supported? If this is regurgitated material, and I know most people involved in the symposium are not probably advocates of the regurgitation and reingestion theory of ectoplasm. Now, stepping back a bit, we've looked at a few photographs. There were 3 mediums who were primarily responsible for the table levitations and the teleplasms. Elizabeth Poole was the medium associated with the table levitations. The Marshall sisters-in-law become involved later. Marianne Marshall first as a regular participant in 1928, and then Susan Marshall joins the group in 1929. Hamilton came to believe that the best phenomena manifested when the regular mediums and participants were present, contributing to the energy of the evolving group mediumship. It's important to note that the Hamilton mediums were non-professionals and none received any financial remuneration for their efforts. In terms of the teleplasms containing the miniature faces that we're interested in today, there were the 2 principal mediums, Marianne Marshall and her sister-in-law, Susan Marshall. Both had seance names, which is often the case, or was the case in these decades. Marianne Marshall was Dawn, and Susan Marshall was Mercedes. They were the individuals essential to the production of the 72 separate teleplasms. And as we will see, many contain miniature faces of individuals who are known to be deceased. Here's the first, or most, not necessarily the first, but this is the most interesting teleplasm containing facial likenesses, because there are 5 facial likenesses, including Robert Louis Stevenson and David Livingston in this ectoplasm. It's blown up here, and the quality is obviously not as good, but one can see 5 different faces there. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but there were a large number of highly educated men and also some women. The focus, unfortunately, is often on privileged white men who were educated as the researchers, and a lot of individuals were making the point that the mediums were largely uneducated women, but that's not the case. Well, that is the case with the Hamiltons, but there were women involved as observers as well, but unfortunately they did not leave the same records that the men did. So I'm just making the point that these men, these medical doctors, lawyers, and clergymen remained associated with the Hamilton research during the lifetime of Dr. Hamilton and Mrs. Hamilton, and continued to support it through the late 1950s, including a series of articles that appeared in the Winnipeg newspaper and in a Toronto newspaper, where portrait photographs of some of the male observers were included. And had they suspected fraud, there's no way these individuals would have continued to allow their names to be associated. I'm just mentioning very briefly Walter Stewart Stinson, who was the main trance control throughout the period of the ectoplasmic research with Dr. and Mrs. Hamilton. And also, we're going to touch on just very briefly Marianne Marshall's continued involvement in seances between 1947 and 1958. And during those first years, 1947 to 1958, Mrs. Sylvia Barber continued the ectoplasmic experimentation with Mary Marshall, including photographs from multiple cameras from multiple different angles. Here's Walter Stewart Stinson. Many of you will recognize Walter from his involvement in his sister's mediumship, that of Mina Stinson Crandon, better known as Marjorie, the Boston medium. And most recently, Walter Stewart Stinson's continued involvement in the mediumship of Stuart Alexander in Hull, Yorkshire. So was it the same Walter? It was widely believed that Walter in both Boston and Winnipeg was Mina Crandon's brother. But in 1934, Dr. Hamilton wrote that neither in the Boston nor Winnipeg experiments has there been forthcoming any formal or conclusive proof supporting the identity he claimed. So it's obvious that Walter self-identified as Mina Stinson Crandon's brother, but there wasn't the ability to substantiate that claim that survival researchers would have liked, and nor to Dr. Hamilton's satisfaction. Now, I'm just going to mention briefly two books. The first, Intention and Survival, was edited by the youngest son, the Hamilton's youngest son, James Hamilton, and first published in 1942, Intention and Survival. A follow-up, a sequel, was published in 1969, Is Survival a Fact? By Margaret Hamilton Bach, the Hamilton's daughter, and the individual who did the most to promote her parents' research and well, it was instrumental in it being deposited at the University of Manitoba archives. So interestingly, and I'm not including it today, but the second book includes photographs that were taken, or one photograph anyhow, that was taken after Dr. Hamilton's death, that shows a miniature portrait of Hamilton against an ectoplasmic screen that the Hamiltons accepted as conclusive evidence that their husband and father had survived death and returned to communicate. With the collaboration of the copyright holders, who are the Hamilton grandchildren and the University of Manitoba, the Hamilton books are now available through the University of Manitoba website. I'm giving here the address of the Survival Research Institute of Canada because that is easier for you to record, and you'll see rotating at the top of the main page of our website a number of photographs. If you click on the portrait photograph of the Hamilton family, you will go to a page with lots of different resources about the Hamiltons, and also links to both of the books that I've just referenced. Now, ultimately, it was intentional activity by transpersonalities that became the focus of the Hamiltons' attention in the writing of those two books, as reflected in the subtitles of the books. And there were often elaborate preparations necessary for teleplasmic product to be photographed, which demonstrates intentional activity by transpersonalities. The controls would often state the number of negative sittings required before photographic results could be obtained. When the sitting was reached at which photographs would be taken, extra precautions were implemented. The cameras would be prepared, and then one of the trans controls would indicate by speech or other motor automatism the moment at which Dr. Hamilton was to explode the flash. Sometimes there would be a description by the medium after the flash was fired, and obviously still during the seance. Here's what Dr. Hamilton wrote in 1934. What would be discovered on the plates when they were developed. Their descriptions very often indicating not only the general nature of the phenomena registered, but their inner and minute details impossible for anyone to see normally in the brief duration of the blinding flash. And sometimes the trance directors would give that information through one of the auxiliary mediums. So it was, if one argues collusion, the circle of individuals who had to be involved in colluding gets larger and larger. And it really makes no sense. I've never been able to I've never been able to accept collusion. I ruled that out very early on. Now, here's an interesting quote again from Dr. Hamilton, who believed that the teleplasms were the outcome of unknown energy accumulation and energy storing processes going on over a considerable period of experimental time, with the psychodynamic energies thus acquired being drawn from every mediumistic source available through each series of consecutive sittings. And that's where the concept of group mediumship comes in, but also in our discussions yesterday, the question was raised about process, and that was processed at a different level in our discussion. But ultimately, if we are to make any progress with respect to understanding physical phenomena and physical mediumship, details such as these that Dr. Hamilton was contemplating in the 1930s need to be addressed. The Hamilton's also observed that the larger the teleplasmic product attempted by trance directors, the more seances that were required before its appearance, numbering at times 20 or more sittings. So they would be required to sit for weeks on end with nothing visible happening, nothing to photograph. And you can imagine how tedious and boring that was to sit in the dark week after week after week. So what of the precautions to preclude fraud? From the start, the Hamilton group implemented whatever precautions they could. Obviously, they were sitting in total darkness, as was what was deemed necessary at the time. The sitters and mediums held hands so that allegedly no person had free use of his or her hands to fraudulently produce the effects photographed. One or more note takers would record the verbal proceedings by shorthand and or longhand, and photographs were taken. Here's one of those, the instances I show it in terms of transparency, but here's a good photograph of Marianne Marshall in the dark dress and Susan Marshall in the white dress. The ectoplasm is at Marianne Marshall's mouth, and you can see that we have the two mediums holding hands. So the skeptics would argue, well, that's not suitable control within the confines of the seance. Additional precautions: when the trance directors predicted that a teleplasm would be photographed, the seance room would be locked and sealed at the end of the previous sittings. Keys would be given to sitters who did not reside in the Hamilton home. Before the sitting commenced, the medium would be examined, new clothing would be provided, and the male sitters would be examined before they entered the room, and a special scrutineer would be invited to observe the proceedings, and guards would be stationed outside the seance room. So the Hamiltons and their colleagues did implement every reasonable precaution for those days. I'm going to just elaborate a bit on one special scrutineer who was a well-known lawyer in Winnipeg, Isaac Pitlater, who became a King's Counsel. In 1926, Isaac and his wife May had witnessed the Marjorie mediumship in their own home, as well as at the Hamiltons during the Crandons' visit to Winnipeg. Unfortunately, the Hamiltons' association with the Crandons has caused some individuals to dismiss the Hamilton research out of hand, including the father of parapsychology, J.B. Ryan, made comments based on probably unfounded comments. He was not involved in the research at all. And also Bill Roll was drawn into making comments about, well, the Hamilton ectoplasm, it looks fraudulent. And it's unfortunate when people who've had no experience of a process venture in. The most remarkable experiment observed by Plato was the Lucy teleplasm, which was about the size of a young girl and was much larger than the majority of teleplasms. So here on the 10th of March, 1930, here's Mary Marshall with her eyes wide open in a deep trance. Over her left shoulder, we can see, seated on its own chair, a very flat-looking face surrounded in that white gauzy material. Here's a better demonstrating that the Hamiltons used cameras from different angles. Here's Lucy seated on her chair between Mary Marshall and William Cooper. And you can see there's double hand control being exercised here. So this becomes increasingly problematic and challenging to explain, given that Mrs. Marshall has been searched, bodily searched. How did they get Lucy into the seance room? The men had been searched. The seance room had been searched. We can see that her hands are being controlled from both sides, and that Isaac Pitlato's hands are controlling the hands of Marianne Marshall and the male sitter on either side. And that's a summer dress or kimono or something that Marianne Marshall is wearing that has been provided by Mrs. Hamilton. And even if she did try to sneak Lucy into the room through collusion with one of the women searchers, does it look like Lucy was easily contained within a dress like that? The mind boggles. The mind absolutely boggles. 2 days later, Pitlato signed an 11-page handwritten statement about precautions taken to preclude the possibility of fraud that mentioned search of the seance room, the mediums and the male sitters, examination and development of photographic films and plates, and he concluded, I am convinced that the phenomenon of the figure seated on the chair to the left of the medium was genuinely produced without the aid of any known physical or material means, process, or apparatus, and that there was no possibility of any fake or trickery. Here's the seance room layout in early 1930. We can see the cabinet drawn at the top of the photograph, the bell box. There was a bell box, I think, ultimately on possibly both sides, or a music machine on one side and a bell box on another side. There's a lot of research that could still be done into the finer details of all this. And we can see that they kept track of where people were seated. So we see that W.B. Cooper, Barney Cooper, was number 1, and Dr. Hamilton's brother, also a medical doctor, Jim Hamilton, was number 9. Those are the men that were controlling Marianne Marshall's hands in the March 1930 Lucy teleplasm. We see the small table. This was a generic photograph of the layout of the Hamilton seance room and the personnel, so we don't see Isaac Pitlato is not drawn in, but Isaac Pitlato was reaching across that small table to control the hands of Marianne Marshall and the men on either side. Now, thanks to Margaret Hamilton Bach, the Hamilton's eldest child and only daughter, the Hamilton research, including seance and research notes, attendance registers, all of the photographs, including lantern slides and glass plate negatives, affidavits and correspondence, all of that material was organized starting in 1979 and deposited at the University of Manitoba Archives and Special Collections in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Here's just an example of the attendance register from the 15th of April, 1926, during the table levitations. And this was an instance when a Mrs. Marshall, or it appears to be a Mrs. Marshall, attended. Presumably that was Mary Marshall attended. I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but I've tried to work through most of the attendance. For me, as a professional archivist, the collection's organization and complexity, the many cross-references between the records that show the Hamiltons' heavy use of the records to compile and publish 2 books demonstrates its authenticity. I went to Winnipeg in 1991 for the first time, I went to Winnipeg to determine how the Hamilton research, how the mediums had faked the Hamilton research, how they pulled the wools over the eyes of the Hamiltons and their colleagues. And 32 years later, or much quicker than that, within a couple of years, I knew that that was impossible. That was not going to happen. And during the course of all that effort, I interviewed hundreds of individuals, everybody who was still living in 1991, 1992, that had any connection whatsoever with the Hamiltons or any of their associates. I have over 700 pages of biographical sketches relating to the Hamiltons and over 100 different individuals I believe I've got sketches about, because I was trying to find the loose link the illicit sex in the seance room, which is the way that most physical mediumship is undone by sex in the seance room. So authenticity of the photographs. There was a battery of cameras installed at the end of the seance room, which eventually included 11 cameras and 3 flashlight devices. And Dr. Hamilton had a handheld remote control apparatus to be able to explode the flashes. You can see the 2 banks of cameras angled inward, pointing towards the other end of the room. In the middle of the 2 banks of cameras are 3 flash apparatus with another camera mounted above the flash apparatus. And on the left-hand side of the image, as we're looking at it, on the left-hand side of the image, we can see a remote control apparatus and a wire that's hanging down from one of the cameras there. It's just perched there to show it, or maybe that's where it was stored between seances, but it's hanging there to show that's how Dr. Hamilton activated the cameras. The photographs were often taken almost simultaneously from more than one angle. Here's a photograph from the stereoscopic photograph showing Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the first Arthur Conan, no, sorry, this is the second Arthur Conan Doyle photograph from the 27th of June, 1932, from Marianne Marshall's nose and possibly mouth. That's a handkerchief tucked under the strap, one of the straps of her dress. That's not ectoplasm. Here we have a wide angle view of the same ectoplasm. We can see that the individuals are all holding hands, and other individuals are in a kind of trance-like state. Here's an enlargement of that ectoplasm showing Arthur Conan Doyle smiling out from the ectoplasm looking upward. We've seen, or will see, that some of the photographs cast a shadow within the room. Here's the first Arthur Conan Doyle ectoplasm. These were not entirely flat. These were 3-dimensional objects. We can see that this is from 2 different angles, 2 very different angles. Same ectoplasm. There's the younger Arthur Conan Doyle, and we can see the shadow that the ectoplasm casts on the body of the medium. There were photographs in timed sequential series, which provides evidence that the teleplasm was in fact again retracted into the body of the medium. We're back now to my first teleplasm of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. On the left of this image, I pasted together, as I found in one of the photograph albums by a member of the Hamilton group, a lawyer, a Winnipeg lawyer, Harry Green, H.A.V. Green. This is the photograph of Charles Haddon Spurgeon from the 1st of May, 1929. And then about 2 minutes later, the residue visible at the medium's mouth. And the beauty of the H.A.V. Green album is that the 2 photographs were pasted together with Harry Green's inscriptions beneath them. And presumably he did this at the time of the photographs, or around the time of the photographs in 1929, 1930. Here's the enlargement again. This is the photograph that convinced me there was something going on that deserved serious scrutiny. Other corroborating evidence: the photographs were developed in Dr. Hamilton's darkroom immediately after the seance. Dr. Hamilton would take with him into the darkroom one or more of the scrutineers or other researchers, often a medical colleague, to demonstrate that photographic plates were not switched or otherwise altered. Guests were encouraged to bring their own photographic equipment. On the 18th of August, 1929, a woman by the name of Ray Bruning Cannon of New York, who was affiliated with the American Society for Psychical Research, used a movie camera to photograph teleplasm as it emerged from Marianne Marshall's mouth. There's evidence in the Hamilton correspondence that camera or another camera was infrared. I am convinced that there was no photographic fraud or trickery based on my careful examination of the photographic record and related records. The table levitations did physically occur in the Hamilton seance room. There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever about that. And I'm also equally convinced that the teleplasms existed temporarily within the three-dimensional reality of the seance room to be photographed in relation to the sitters and seance room background. The integrity of Dr. Hamilton and his family is beyond question. The impression I obtained speaking with individuals who knew him, who had been patients of his, was that Dr. Hamilton was like a saint in the Winnipeg community in which he lived, practiced medicine, and carried out his investigations. Some individuals, contemporaries of the Hamiltons, maintained that the human mind and body possessed capabilities that, though not yet understood, were able to produce the strange phenomena. In other words, the abnormal psychology theory, which cannot be ruled out. But no one who attended the seances or knew the individuals involved dared to impugn their personal integrity by suggesting that they were a party to fraud. And in fact, there are no factual allegations of fraud regarding the Hamilton research. All that we have is innuendo by individuals who did not attend the seances. Most of the Hamiltons for sure, and most of their associates were convinced the ectoplasmic phenomena provided conclusive evidence of a continued existence in an afterlife state. And in fact, that is what Hamilton concluded around 1932, that the survival hypothesis was the only theory capable of explaining all of the phenomena witnessed. We come back to the intentional activities of discarnate trance personalities, because that's not the phenomena themselves, but the intentional activities and predictions that manifested in a consistent and corroborating manner over 15 years was what convinced the Hamiltons. Now, just very briefly, because Marianne Marshall continued, as I've mentioned, she continued the research, the ectoplasmic research with Lillian Hamilton, and then in the Sylvia Barber home circle from 1947 to 1958, the photography was limited from the early years until 1950. So there was just a few years. We can see here that on the far left of this photograph is Victor Sifton. We're quite certain it's Victor Sifton. We know he attended these series of seances. He was the publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press and went on to be the Chancellor of the University of Manitoba within a couple of years, and was the Chancellor for almost, I believe, 8 years. There's Mary Marshall with another ectoplasmic manifestation hanging from her mouth. Interestingly, that is a partial materialization of the face of Walter Stinson. And the woman on the far right of the photograph is the photographer Sylvia Barber. Again, Sylvia Barber was taking photographs from multiple angles. I've not yet determined how many cameras she had, but I know for sure there were 3 cameras. There may have been 4 or 5 cameras that she was using. We can see the remote control apparatus in her left hand. In some of the photographs, we can see the remote control. She's born in Reykjavik in 1892, comes to Manitoba with her family in 1899. She's married twice, divorced for the second time in she's married twice, widowed for the second time in 1931, and started conducting seances in her home starting in 1946. She was a hairdresser by profession. And I just wanted to include this, we're very close to the end, include this ectoplasmic voice box on Mary Marshall's right ear. It's hanging from Mary Marshall's right ear. You can see also that the group did automatic writing. There's a pencil and paper ready to be used. So in this photograph from the 1st of February 1950, there's an ectoplasmic voice box, as well as a piece of ectoplasm covering Marianne Marshall's nose. In my opinion, the Hamilton ectoplasmic experiments are the best documented worldwide. My conclusion, I believe that the teleplasms for which Marianne Marshall and Susan Marshall were responsible were genuine. On that basis, I can concur with the Hamiltons that the miniature faces and intentional actions by trans personalities provide strong evidence for survival of human consciousness. What's the current state of research? On the 3rd of June, 2008, I was invited to Stuart Alexander's home circle in Hull, Yorkshire. It was a very last-minute invitation, thanks to Gerald O'Hara. I was staying with Gerald and his partner, Eric, at the time. And as the only guest that evening, I was invited to the small oval table to experience the hand of Walter Stewart Stinson. My notes typed late into the night that evening, late into the next morning, in fact, about the hand that emerged from the dark pulsating mass of ectoplasm resemble Leslie Kean's description, as well as that of Michel Granger and others. So I'm one more witness to the Walter Stewart Stinson hand in Stuart Alexander's mediumship. The world's leading authority on ectoplasm is Michel Granger, who's a retired chemist living in France. I've collaborated with him historically since 2004. Michel has spent more than 20 years researching 500 cases of ectoplasm worldwide. His magnum opus, 3 volumes in 2,700 pages, includes 850 images of phenomena and protagonists. It's not translated into English. I know someone will ask that, and I cannot imagine it being translated into English because of the amount of work that would take. Granger is critical of the ectoplasmic research. He acknowledges that a vast majority of it has been faked over the last 150 years. He's not convinced of survival, yet he concludes that and this is a quote that Michel approved, he concludes that there remain enough cases to consider the existence of ectoplasm as a true phenomenon of physical mediumship. I would encourage all of you, any of you who are serious about ectoplasm, to invest in a copy of La Saga de l'Ectoplasme, a great deal for 28 euros, available from this website, the Kardec Association in France. Volume 1 was published last year, and Volume 2 is coming out in October of 2022. So just a few more months to wait for Volume 2. Infrared photography. Well, Harry Edwards photographed ectoplasmic structures with Jack Weber using infrared in 1938, 1939. Infrared, as we know, can also be used to expose fraud. So in 1960, Andrija Puharic and Tom O'Neill obtained permission to photograph a seance in Camp Chesterfield. They obtained permission in advance from the medium. I don't know whether they said they were going to use infrared photography, but it was a huge bust. So that was Camp Chesterfield's first exposure. And then Lamartine lambasted what was going on at Camp Chesterfield again in 1976 in the Psychic Mafia. I think we need to make the difference between a stable sitter group and today's traveling road shows of mediums who make a living and travel from town to town. Gary Mannian's exposure led to Psychic News' Truth campaign, supported by Roy Stemmen, the Arthur Findlay College, and some spiritualist churches. My conclusion: scientific investigation is impossible without a physical medium who agrees from the outset to non-invasive thermal imaging. And I will conclude with this slide provided by Roy Stemmen about the Psychic News Truth campaign that dates from Gary Mannian's exposure. So thank you for your time.
All right. So physical mediumship, psychic surgery, and healing. And I want to thank Helané for this opportunity. I had photos that were in storage for 20 years, and I pulled them out and discovered that they had been somewhat damaged by mold and moisture. So I was able to take pictures of them and save them. So thank you for that. And also, I really had a lot of catching up to do on my physical mediumship literature reading. And so this was a great way to just dive into it. And I'm just so excited about this topic. So we're going to be covering, and let me just minimize this over here. Okay, we're going to be covering European physical mediums and healing, and then Brazilian psychic surgery research and case studies, and then psychic surgery in the Philippines. And I'll be giving an autoethnographical account of my year of living and studying with the Philippine faith healers. And then the formal research, and then just a couple other mentions of research that could be done in this area. And then I'm really excited. I don't know if we'll have a chance to do too much discussion, but some of the cases I'll be touching on, I know those present have been personally involved in. So, physical mediumship. Just to go over my methods for my literature review, I found that there really wasn't a whole lot of hardly anything on physical mediumship and healing where it would be a cohesive paper written about it. So what I decided to do was first identify the best case of physical mediums that have already been identified, and there's already been lots of discussion of those best cases so far. And then I chose 7 of them. And then I searched books for those 7 mediums or cases, and I looked to see how many mentations there were of healing and healed, and then looked to see how many of these had to do with physical healing. So that's what I really was focusing on, were physical cases of healing as opposed to psychological or mental. And I also searched the Bix essays, and I talked to researchers in the field to find out if I was missing anything, such as Sophia Weaver and Stephen Brody and Jeffrey Mishlove. And I only had 2 months to do all of this. So I know there's so many countries and cultures that I wasn't able to cover, but that's something I would love to do in the future, because I know that's going to be really interesting. But as I said, I will be covering the Brazilian and Philippine healers in the second part of this. So psychological healing is implied and central to every seance sitting. So the overall purpose is to bring emotional and mental healing through evidence, communication, and connection. Physical healing is an effect, a phenomena, and present, but not always a primary focus for participants or for researchers. And I suspect it happens a lot, but for different reasons, the researchers have not focused so much on that. So these are the 7 cases: Dee Home, Kluski, Northridge, Duncan, the Skull Group, overall as a group, George Chapman, and Stuart Alexander. And so I studied whatever available materials I could find. And so there was just one case, and this was sent to me by Sylvia Weaver as an important example of healing. So many of you are probably familiar with him, but he was considered one of the most impressive physical mediums in terms of his ability to levitate other phenomena. So he was said to even levitate pianos and tables with people sitting on them. And on over 100 occasions, it was reported that he was able to levitate himself. And he also was known to materialize sometimes numerous hands, like 8 or 9 at a time, that would even hand people flowers. So in a letter dated 1857, he shared with his wife how he healed a boy who had lost his hearing due to effects of typhoid fever. And he seemed very, very amazed at what had just occurred. And he explained it that he was on his way to leave on a ship to come back home from overseas. And a woman had brought her son to see him. And he was really busy and rejecting people, telling them he didn't have time for them. But he felt like he couldn't turn her away. So she started to talk to him and with the 15-year-old boy that was sitting next to him, and just talking about all the problems that they had gone through, because he had been deaf for 4 or 5 years. And so he wrote, during the recital, told with all the warmth and tenderness of a mother's heart, and describing the various surgical operations to which he had been subjected, my sympathies were deeply moved. And I had unwittingly thrown my arm around the boy and drawn him towards me, so that the boy's head rested upon my shoulder. Whilst in this position, and as the madam was telling some of the most painful particulars, I passed my hand caressingly over the boy's head, upon which he, partly lifting his head, suddenly exclaimed in a voice trembling with emotion, "Mama, I hear you." So from this, there were a few people present, including a princess and some other people, and word got out, and this was confirmed that he had been deaf and now he wasn't any longer. And I thought this case was important for a couple reasons. One is a guy who can levitate pianos is still amazed that he could have this spontaneous case of healing. And healing took place simply from compassion. Now, of course, we don't know what other kind of energetic or spiritual elements were involved, but he wasn't trying to do anything. He wasn't sitting there focusing on, let me heal this person. He just got into a mode of just feeling genuine compassion. And this is oftentimes a question for healers of all modalities: how much emphasis, how much time is needed during a healing session. And this shows it can just happen really instantaneously. And we'll juxtapose this with the very dramatic healing examples and manifestations of the Philippine healers, because there's also always the question with that kind of healing is this really necessary for what we ultimately want to accomplish? So another person was Frana Kluski. And now I found just a few examples in a manuscript. It was actually not Zophia's published book I found this in, but when I was doing research in the Ingo Swann archives at University of West Georgia for a couple years, I worked in the file room, and I came across a box one day of this manuscript that looked like it was unpublished, and it was a very rough draft. And so I have just had that in my possession for a while. So I looked through that, and there were a few references to the medieval medic and this says here, the medieval medic. So this was a manifestation of Kluski's, and just a little background on him. Probably a lot of you are familiar with him, but he would manifest all sorts of hands and full apparitions and very weird things, different creatures. There was one creature that would make this clicking noise with his mouth, but wouldn't really say anything. In my next picture here, on my next slide, he had this manifestation of a giant bird appeared on his head. And this is a picture. I'm sure some of you have a lot more background on this than I do. But so his mediumship was already very interesting. And so, but there wasn't a whole lot of mention of healing in his case, besides for an old medic that would come around and touch people. And sometimes fragrances would come, such as the smell of roses or fresh fruit. And in one case, it was said that he came around to someone sitting there, and the old medic, that's basically how the medieval doctor, and he was able to give some information that was later confirmed by the sitter's doctor. So, but there weren't too many cases with him. And so Sophia Weaver brought up that it's very possible that he would have had the ability to heal, but he was oftentimes so ill during the seances and afterwards. And he would so much, probably all mediums do this, but he would so much take on whatever people were their ailments that probably healing was not going to be a good profession for him. So Isa Northridge is one of the cases where she was very oriented towards healing. She had already been a nurse in the Women's Royal Air Force. She's considered a really strong case here too. And she channeled several guides, one named Dr. Reynolds, who fully materialized and sometimes conducted surgery by inserting a spirit hand into the patient to remove growths in full light. And since I have so many slides to cover, I was going to read some examples here. But one of the things that was interesting was that Dr. Reynolds supposedly worked with another doctor in spirit form, Hollander. So I will read this. A trumpet standing on the floor was seen to rise, and a voice from it said, This is Dr. Hollander, and I thank you for your assistance to Reynolds and myself. This is my first operation of such a type. I was a brain specialist on Earth. I discussed this case with Reynolds, and we decided to operate by killing the tumor, and then, when the life had gone out, to dematerialize it and take it away. Everything will be all right now, and so will the eyes. And then people in the room did observe him going into the body and pulling out the mass that they said had a very strong odor. And again, this was, these communications came through direct voice. Okay, and then just another, I'm just going to move on here to Helen Duncan, who was considered the last witch because she had been prosecuted as a witch under the, I forget the name of the law, but she was the last person to actually be prosecuted and put in jail. And this was on a couple occasions. One, she was able to, during the seance, she gave information about a ship, a naval ship that had sunk, and no one knew about it at the time. And she also had information for a mother that the son had died on a ship, and also that had not been reported to the public. So the government got word of that, and then she was prosecuted for that. She's also somebody, probably you guys already know this, but she is an example of why we should be concerned about ectoplasma and when it gets touched or interrupted by other people in the room, because she, after she got out of jail, she then ended up practicing for, or at least sitting in more seances. And during a police raid, she was touched, and I think it was maybe about 3 or 4 weeks later, she died. And it was said that she died because of being touched during her ectoplasma excretions. So just Dr. Williams was Helen's main spirit guide. His name was Dr. Williams. She had another guide who spoke to a living doctor and told him to inform a fellow circle member that a growth on his face was cancer, but that he'd come directly to help. Now, the Skull group, not going to give you background here. Obviously, it's a strong case, although we heard from Peter, not everybody believed everything was authentic, but many people did. And so here, what I found was when I examined the Solomon book, I found 6 examples, 6 mentions of healing taking place, which is not really a lot considering how much phenomena was produced. And some of the spirit communicators said that healing would be a very large and important part of the work of the Skull group and the New Spiritual Science Foundation. And then there was a case, I found that most of the mentions of healing for the Skull group had to do with lights moving into people, and then people feeling some kind of effect from the light. And people described how the lights felt as they moved through their body, and that then they had healing effects after that. So I would say that was mostly what was reported. In the formal SPR report by Keene and his researchers, they wrote that one of the men on whose chest the light was seen to settle and disappear said he felt something physical inside him, a movement around his chest. Emily said there was a healing operation. Perhaps he had something amiss in his chest. The light emerged from him, and he confirmed that he had a heart condition. So I just thought it was interesting, again, that it didn't seem like the researchers were too focused on healing. And then Stuart Alexander is a really phenomenal case. And I know Leslie Keene is mentioned in his book in a few different places, so she could speak a lot to Stuart. But basically, Stuart channeled Dr. Franklin Barnett. This was not the only entity he channeled, but this was a main one. And he said he was a 19th century Scottish physician who worked through the trumpet medium George Valentine. So he through direct voice and a light that grows in size, Dr. Barnett approaches many people who can feel large hands. This is what, when I looked at all the different mentions across these books, so there's Alexander's own book, and then Katie Halliwell wrote basically 3 volumes of her experiences with the group. And so there were several mentions of healing by different people across many different seances and countries. And I thought it was interesting that they always described Barnett's hands as large. There was never any mention where they did not say that these hands were large. So I thought that was interesting. And then there were many discussions about healing effects taking place, and doctors later confirming that a disease or disorder had now was in remission. And sometimes it would start as lights and then form as hands, and then sometimes there would be full materializations. And so the only mention of ectoplasm that I found in any of this material in terms of as it related to healing itself. Now you can assume that perhaps the hands had to come from the ectoplasm or the other materializations, so that would be an assumption. But Katie was almost completely deaf. She could hear a little bit, so she wasn't completely deaf. Let me backtrack, but she was very, very hard of hearing, and it was almost, she described it as almost impossible to hear if she wasn't reading lips, which obviously could be a problem in the seance room. And she was told on a number of occasions by the spirits, supposedly, that they were going to help her hear. And they told her and described how ectoplasm tubes were created to help her, where they would come from the medium and they would attach to her ears. And she said that whenever there was direct voice, she was able to hear very clearly, whereas when there wasn't direct voice, she would have to have people interpret with her what was going on. And then the final example is George Chapman, who channeled Dr. William Lang. And he is really considered one of the greatest examples of where his entire purpose, or at least the single spirit that he channeled the most, was William Lang, and he channeled him for 30 years. And basically, he would become him, sometimes for as long as 6 hours at a time. And so for over 60 years, he embodied him. And this case was particularly impressive, well, for a number of reasons. He would take on the mannerisms, the voice, the physiology of Lang, who was an actual physician. And he would give such particular diagnoses that would very much conform with people's medical diagnoses. And so he had many physicians and dentists coming to him, and he even was awarded a contract with a medical center where on a weekly basis he contracted with doctors to give them advice, and the doctors would come and ask about their own health, but that of their patients. And I wrote down here, one of the things that I thought was really cool was that he was saying, he was explaining the whole process he went through before. Now this is Dr. Lang, the spirit, talking about what he had to do in order to find the right medium. And he was saying that it's not easy to do, that it took a lot of preparation, and he had to wait a long time to find the right person to work through. You know, a lot of times for mediums, it's the other way around. They're hoping that they can find the right person, the right spirit who will want to work with them. So I think this is perhaps encouraging for budding mediums. So healing themes of physical mediums. First and foremost, as I've outlined here, 5 out of 7 mediums had guides that were former doctors as healers. And it may even be that there were more, I'm sure there had to have been some doctors coming through in the Skoll group as well. But this also made me think about the presentation with where we see artists or spirit art. It's very possible that it's just whatever a spirit was involved in when they were alive, they would naturally still have that interest. Now, also, the main doctors had other doctor friends. So Dr. Ling worked with his son. Dr. Reynolds had helpers too, such as Dr. Hollander, who sometimes manifested through the trumpet. So it seemed to be that it was said on a number of occasions that doctors were working with other doctors in their spirit form. The doctor spirits sometimes go on to help multiple mediums, such as Dr. Barnett supposedly worked with another medium, Mr. Valentino, decades before. This has been true of many other mediums. Healing themes of European physical mediums. Healing is central in some cases, but not others. Healings can be dramatic and involve fanfare, or it can just happen when the medium is sitting with a person, as in the case of Dee Dee Holm. Ectoplasm is an element in hearing tubes and healing hands. Lights by themselves, or lights then manifesting into direct voices, touches, hands entering into people, and a combination of diagnosis and healing. Sometimes full apparitions do the healing. And how is healing by physical mediums assessed? So how are researchers assessing the validity of these cases? Case studies examine patient, relative, and doctor testimony, comparison of medical records to mediums' diagnoses, comparison of patient's state prior to the healing and after, and comparison of what the patient and others experienced during the healing event and how it corresponds with effects such as lights and hands approaching. And I would say, really, as I go into the subject now of psychic surgery, that those are also tend to be some of the main ways that healing is assessed as well, with a few exceptions. So next, for psychic surgery. So when looking at the psychic surgery literature, there was quite a bit more on this than the physical medium literature. And I'm hearing a little noise. I'm wondering if is there anyone who's unmuted? Okay. All right. So the psychic surgery literature, there was quite a bit. There was historical, ethnographical, philosophical. The philosophical was interesting. It was showing how there so often tends to be this bias towards biomedical by researchers versus spiritual, whereas they were saying that for the healers themselves, they don't have that same bias. They respect the biomedical or allopathic modes of helping people as well. But a lot of times, people are coming to healers because all other attempts at being healed by the medical profession has failed. And they found that both had a dualistic perspective, where it was seen that healing, there was a sense of a separation between the body and the spirit, and both a connection, but also a separation. And they noticed too that a lot of times these healers only spent a very brief time with the patient, not getting to know the patient or even preparing them for the healing that was about to take place. And that was true with both allopathic doctors and the healers. And so then there was also many studies about the examination of patients' conditions and experience, the physical testing of materials and photographic evidence, and general challenges of testing healing in relation to the placebo effect, and how there's multiple variables going on during these healings. So it can be really hard to isolate what is the cause. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So not going to have too much time to cover this, but what I found so fascinating was that psychic surgery is very much rooted in European spiritualism. Alan Kardec, who even before the as PR was formed, he published a journal, and this journal, the review, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but his journal was used as a promotional tool to spread the philosophy and doctrine and content of Spiritism. So he really organized a whole movement, a whole religion. And then at the time, there were people from the Philippines and Brazil who were studying in Europe, and they took back his teachings and formed these whole movements. And it was said and he wrote 3 books that were channeled. Kardec channeled these books, and the books, I'm just going to pass over this, but basically, he was told that it was spirits that were guiding his organization, and said that it should be the spiritual direction will be the supreme authority of the association. And so the spirits were really in charge of this whole movement and of his books. And that is an ongoing theme for the Philippine healers, that the spirits are really in charge. Now, you can see this also in European circles and seances, that the spirits are in charge. The spirits are researchers, the spirits are doctors, and in this case, they are also running an organization. So that might be encouraging for those of you who run your own organizations. It might be easier just to step aside and let the spirits do their work. Okay, so types of surgery. There is psychic surgery, where there's actual operation on the spirit, on the physical body, where the healers are actually operating with instruments. So we'll talk about that. That's particularly with the Brazilian healers. And then psychic surgery, healing with manifestations and materializations, but not an actual operation. And that would be true of within the Philippines. And then healing the astral, etheric, spiritual, and physical body, channeling healing effects, but where you don't have any manifestations. So we'll be talking about the first 2. And so Brazilian psychic surgeons, some have rituals and rules beforehand. Some will tell people that they can't have sexual relations right before the healing, or for a period of time before, a period of time after. John of God, who I will talk about a little bit later, he had the way that his healings worked, where people would come to his place and they would sit in what was called sitting in the current, with dozens of mediums, sometimes hundreds of people. Now, I think this is really important, because a lot of times people want to attribute the healing that supposedly takes place, or healing effects, to the healer. And I think another theory, especially in cases with healers that have been found to be committing trickery or fraud, or just in the case of John of God, where some of you, I'm sure everyone is aware, but he was charged with having molested over 300 women. And so just such horrendous accusations against him by so many people. In a way, I really debated whether or not I even wanted to bring up his name, but given that he's been the most well-known Brazilian psychic surgeon in recent times, I think that it's important that we don't just gloss over these cases, because for a long time he was really held up there as someone who is well researched, and I'll get into the research in just a couple minutes here. But it may very well be that it's not necessarily the person themselves, but the other mediums that are there working together as a group that are creating the healing effect. And I had some experience with that also myself in the Philippines, where I initially really thought, well, I'm not feeling so much during these psychic surgery operations, like I'm not really feeling anything except a little pressure in my body. And yet, right before, when I'm sitting in the chapel or sitting in another environment with the other people around me, I'm feeling massive amounts of energy moving through me and around me. And so this would be an explanation for why that is. But getting back to the Brazilian psychic surgeons, sometimes they didn't have that at all. They would just jump right into a healing. One of the most well researched cases is Argio, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, Arigo. And so there was a study done on him. And let me just go back to here. So there was a study, and researchers looked at 518 cases. They attempted to verify his cures by obtaining patients' medical records before and after. Among 545 patients for which there were diagnostic records, it was found that his instant diagnoses agreed with those made by the patient's doctors in 95% of the cases. In another study of trance surgery in Brazil, so 9 trance surgeons, in this study, it was observed several thousand patients were being treated by 9 trance surgeons, and several hundred cases were videotaped. And topographic brain mapping revealed increased brain activity when the healer mediums were engaged in trance behaviors. Their results suggest the presence of a hyper-aroused brain state associated with the trance behaviors of the healers. They believe that such a state is required for this practice, but other factors may also be involved. In the patients, their brain waves revealed no high-frequency brain activity. They found cortical quieting, suggesting relaxation, despite the absence of anesthesia. So that was present in so many different Brazilian psychic surgeons, and there seems to be quite a bit of them where they are actually doing surgeries without anesthesia. And the interesting thing about this is that in all the cases researched, in all the articles I found of people observing these, and again, many researchers observing thousands of cases, there were only sometimes maybe 1 or 2 cases where someone felt a little bit of pain, even though they have knives and other instruments going into them. So no one can really explain that. Then also the one common practice is to try to examine whatever tissue is extracted from the bodies. And in this case, they found a tumor excised from the patient did reveal a human fibroadenoma. They concluded that these practices are usually benign and that pain is absent. But they found serious illness not likely to improve without treatment may do so after trance surgery procedures are performed. And so this was typical of the research I found. I have a lot more slides here, but I'm just going to move through these. These are just a couple cases. In one case, Sidney Greenfield, he studied 3 different healers. And I thought this was an interesting quote. He asked the couple if they believed in God. Before they could answer, he picked up a scalpel from the tray in my hand, and while ordering them both to think of God, plunged it into the man's left eye with his right hand under the lid. With a series of jabbing and twisting motions, he slid the instrument down under the eye. As he did this, he substituted the back of a pair of tweezers taken from the tray with his left hand for the scalpel. And then I'll just share one more before moving on to the Filipino healers. He said here a patient had been suffering from sinus problems, and a pair of scissors were driven up each of her nostrils deep into the sinus cavity to demonstrate that in spite of the apparent lack of a sepsis, there would be no infection. Edson asked a bystander to spit on the gauze he wrapped around one of the pairs of scissors before driving it into the sinus cavity. The healer regularly asked those observing him to introduce germs and other contaminants into open wounds. Now, that is pretty disgusting and does raise serious ethical concerns, whether or not it is true that these healing abilities would actually prevent disease from happening. This would, of course, never fly if they had to go through a review board before a study. And because of this, it would be my recommendation that if psychic surgery is going to be studied, that maybe instead of studying the Brazilian healers that are actually doing surgery, might want to leave that aside and more so study healers that are having the manifestations without the surgery, because there's just too many ethical issues involved. I think even if you go to the other countries, there's still concern. And in this case, this healer, he actually, it was Sidney Greenfield observed him. The healer then took what appeared to be an electrical saw with a 6-inch blade attached to it from the lower shelf of a cart. And he inserted the turning blade into an open wound, running it along the spinal column. A small amount of blood splurted up as the opening in the patient's back was enlarged. And when it was all over, he just pushed him on a cart, leaving the wound open until an assistant came to wrap it up or to sew it back up. And so again, in these cases, there has been research into, did the person then get an infection? And a lot of times they didn't seem to do looking way into the future, how the patient was doing. They were just able to check in like a few days afterwards. And as a few days, just in a short period of time, they did not typically find complaints of affection or ongoing pain or things like that. But still, obviously, this is very problematic. And what if even if this was under the direction of a spirit, something came to interrupt that spirit's intervention, and now he's got a saw in the person's body. I would be concerned about that. But John of God was tested, and a lot of people did feel 74% reported being helped and relieved of their ailments. In another study of John of God, out of 30 surgeries, post-healing exams conducted and samples of tissue were collected for 6 patients. I'm just going to skip. Only one person complained of moderate pain. I thought this was interesting. Oh, let's see, I'm missing my slide. But basically, they found that when they studied the tissue that was taken from John of God, of his samples, that some had to do, some were tested as human blood, some were tested as animal, some was dye, and some was an assortment of materials.